All right. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the General Eclectic Podcast with Rod Dreer. I am your host, Kale Zeldin. We're here for episode 6, season 3. Rod, how goes the battle, my friend?
It goes great, man.
Yeah.
You and I both had birthdays this week. We have the same birthday, February 14th.
Yes,
So,
yes.
how was it for you?
It was great. It was grand. I have mixed feelings about having a birthday on Valentine's Day, as you might imagine, because it basically makes it impossible for me to do one of my most favorite things in the world to do, which is to go out to eat. Um, so, uh, so at any rate, one manages. But honestly, today, or rather, my birthday yesterday, I turned 50, Rod. So the
You
big
turned 50. Holy
yes,
crap.
yes,
All right. Can I just tell you something? All right. Yeah, I'm 56. I turned
right,
56.
right.
It's downhill, man. This is my primary exercise in this world is walking to the bathroom like 4 or 5 times during the night. I mean, nobody told me this was going to happen. I'm like, and I think about my dad when my dad was my age. I was in my 20s, and I was
Yeah.
like, these old guys complaining about this, that, and the other. I'll be young forever.
Forever. Yeah, well, I'm certainly not young forever, but it's just kind of wild. I really have no problem with the whole age thing. It's like it's kind of interesting. I've never been one of these sort of hangups. It's never been a personal hang up for me, but it is kind of amazing to think that you've made it a half century. Like that's a pretty
Yeah.
remarkable run. So, at any rate, there it
Well,
is.
and I gotta say
Yeah.
that, I mean, and this is something you and I can talk about. It's
Mm.
that, you're at the half century mark. I'm just over the half century mark. And the world, as much as it's changed in our lifetime, I think that it was pretty stable compared to what we're getting into right now.
Yeah, it's funny. That's been sort of part of my thinking the last couple of days, maybe the last week or so, just kind of coming to terms with what appears to be, and maybe this plays a little bit into our temperaments, Rod. I'm not sure, but it appears to be that we have been kind of waiting for things to return to some kind of normal. And maybe, just maybe, the normal that we have come to expect in our now 50 plus years is actually probably not so normal, is it?
No, it's not. I mean, I, I this seems like a small thing, maybe, but I think it's a condensed symbol of what's happening in the world. I've been paying attention the past week to the General Synod of the Church of England.
Mhm,
We all know the Anglican Church is a hot mess,
mhm.
but they spent a few days having an intense debate over whether or not to approve marriage for same-sex couples,
Right.
and they ended up doing the classic Anglican fudge that pleases nobody. They're not going to marry gay couples, but they're going to bless their relationships. Well, understandably, people who favored this are pissed off about it because they're like, wait, what? We're second class couples.
Mhm,
But conservatives who say, like, you can't do this. I mean, it's sinful according to the Bible. They're
mhm.
like, wait, you can't bless sin. Even if you're not marrying them, it's still, you're blessing them. So it's not going to last. The thing that kills me, though, and even though I'm not part of the Church of England,
Sure.
and neither
Neither
of
am
us are.
I. But our
No,
friends are. We
but
have friends. We have good friends in
yeah,
there.
but when I was in London recently, I was talking to an Anglican vicar, and he said, our church is going to cease to exist by 2060. I'm like, oh, what do you mean? And he showed me some data, and I went and independently verified this,
Mhm,
that
mhm.
the rate of decline is so massive and so few young people. Do you know only 1% of Britons in age 18 to 24, 1% only say they're members of the Church of England.
Wow.
So, I mean,
One
it
1% of that
1%.
of that cohort. I mean, that's what's even more
Yeah,
astounding.
of the future, and so there is no future for the Church of England.
Mhm.
So you see that, and by the way, the Catholic Church in Britain is going
The
down
same.
at the same
It's
rate.
the
Yeah,
same. Yeah, yeah, it's the same.
and so I like, what the hell is wrong with you people that you're talking about whether or not you should marry same-sex couples? They were also talking about God's pronouns. Can we refer to God as he anymore? Like the house is on fire, but you're sitting there talking about these minor things. Same in the Catholic Church, the
Yeah,
Synod on synodality
right.
in Europe, which is where the Christendom first got going. It's collapsed or is in process of collapsing. I was in Ireland recently, visiting Paul Kingsnorth, and to talk to people there about the state of the Catholic Church and Christianity in general, it is a disaster
Mm.
zone. And yet, the leaders of the Catholic Church, like the leaders in the Anglican Church, they seem completely copacetic in the face of all this. And I think that there's something larger going on here.
Yeah, I do too. I was also working with a kind of house metaphor earlier today. As I was thinking of this issue, and it's like the leader of the pack, the house owner in this case, is worried about redecorating the living room or like the sitting room. And that you're busy picking out like the colors of the drapes, and what kind of fixtures you want on the wall, and what kind of all of this sort of interior stuff. And meanwhile you have major structural problems going on with the building, such that termites have destroyed the structural integrity of the building,
Uh-huh.
and you are totally consumed with literal superficialities. Now, I don't think those issues as such are superficial. Don't
Right, right,
misunderstand
right.
me. But the fact that you could even spend 5 minutes talking about God's pronouns, a truly tangential issue in the larger scheme of things, when you're talking about the whole thing is
Yeah.
dying.
Oh, look, just before we came on, I was looking at the news. The Republican Party in Washington is now talking about sending even more billions to fight the war in Ukraine. Meanwhile, our own country is falling apart. Did you see what happened with the train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio?
I did. I was really struck by this. At first I was sort of, I seemed, I was, it was in the middle of all of this stuff going on with huge, massive Chinese balloons surveilling the country, and weird, unidentified flying objects, or unidentified whatever, UPIs or UFOs or whatever they call it these days, being shot down in Wisconsin and Alaska. I mean, I was sort of overwhelmed with all this stuff going on. And then meanwhile, there's this explosion in Palestine, Ohio, which at first I'm like, all right, fine, like train derailment, that's weird, right? Sort of, but it's not just a normal train derailment, is it, Ron?
No, 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 no. From what I've been reading, they had some extremely toxic chemicals there, and people who live in the area, they had to evacuate the area fearing an explosion. But people are talking about how birds are falling out of the sky, fish are turning belly up in the rivers.
Chickens are dying, like just like neighborhood chickens are just
Yeah,
dying.
like we can afford to lose any more
Right,
chickens with eggs.
chickens, right? Yeah, amen,
But
amen. Seriously,
but then this is happening, and some people have been calling it America's Chernobyl, which may be a little overstated, but it's a really bad thing. And yet, our transportation secretary Pete Buttigieg, in his first public appearance after this derailment, what does he talk about? Not that. He talks about how white construction workers are taking the jobs of people of color. It's like,
yeah,
you idiot, you
yeah.
McKinsey idiot, you consulting class idiot. There you are. You're in charge of the
Yeah.
transportation agency. I mean, I'm not saying it's his fault this happened, but
No.
we've got major problems with our rail industry. The infrastructure is falling apart. But what he cares about is what his class cares about, his professional class, which is DEI.
Yeah, what struck me about this, and look, pick, today it's Mayor Pete, pick another political appointee, later on. But today we're talking about, sorry, Secretary Pete is the new moniker, and it's so cute, right? The Secretary Pete thing. And I gotta say, not only is he kind of prattling on about this sort of strange, historic inequities of communities of color, and if you see the clips, you know exactly what I'm talking about, Rod. But there seems to be a kind of unwillingness to do or to oversee, the job that you actually have in front of you,
Yeah.
right? And as you point out, this is not the fact that there was a problem in Palestine, Ohio, is not Secretary Pete's fault. Right. But what is striking to me is not only do you have like this sort of physical breakdown of infrastructure, right? And cue the infrastructure weak jokes here, but there seems to be, as part of this story, a strange corruption and labeling and mishandling of the entire situation. And they kind of tried to do some sort of control burn, but you can't do a control burn on the kind of chemicals that these trains were housing. And so it's just such a weird, funny thing. Now,
Yeah,
it's also particularly funny, Rod, because if you recall, when he got the job originally, he said that he got the job originally because he liked to play with toy trains when he was a boy.
oh gosh, really?
Yeah,
Wow.
actually, this is not Kale making it up.
That's a sweet thing.
Yeah.
But I think that there's a general point to be made here that it seems that our leadership class across institutions, not just at the federal government level, they're just not paying attention to what's really happening.
Mhm.
I read something this week about how in some state, it might be New York State, I could be wrong, fourth graders, most of them can't read at grade level.
Right.
But
Right.
what do we really care about? Reading, drag queen story hour and educating these kids and how they may not be the gender that they were quote unquote assigned at birth. It's just like it's a fundamental unseriousness.
Right. Right.
And you got me to read in this past week a book by Peter Zeihan. Is that how you say his name?
Zion.
Yeah. What's the title of the book? It's like it's about the end of the world is just the beginning.
Yeah,
Or
hold on.
something.
I got it right here. Hold on. I got to do it because I'm listening. I'm watching. The End of the World is Just the Beginning: Mapping the Collapse of Globalization by Peter Zeihan. And yeah, I got to tell you, like, this is one of those books you kind of stumble upon, and um, you're like, whoa, I think I've been looking at the world in woefully inadequate and uncomplex ways. And he is really rocking my world with this thing. And his
Yeah.
focus on population and geography and economics and supply chains, like it's a serious. I don't know ultimately what I think about his final analysis here, but it is a serious look at the kind of physical, practical realities of our modern economic system
Yeah.
in our
Well, yeah,
world.
his basic
Globalization, right?
right. His
Right.
basic point is that globalization is in collapse right now, not gonna collapse, but it's collapsing right now. Many of us just don't understand it. And he
Right.
talks about how the post-war period since 1945 has been just an absolutely extraordinary period in the history of the world. We never had it so good for so long, and we never
Right.
will again.
Right.
And it's the kind of thing that I've had to learn to be suspicious of these sort of claims because I totally bought into peak oil
I was
back
just
then.
it's funny, yeah. Like, so this morning I was literally saying the same thing. Like, I remember like hearing about Pico and be like, oh man, and then it's sort of my mind kind of goes crazy. So I know that both of us are cautious about these kinds of things
Right, right.
precisely for that, right?
But I just came back before we came on. I had dinner tonight with a couple of guys from Spain, young guys in their
Mhm.
20s, and
Mhm.
just talking about conditions in Spain, the economy, politics, and things. And the number one thing they care about is demographics because Spain has the lowest fertility rate in all of Europe. It's like 0.8%. And the thing that Peter Zeihan brings out in his analysis is, once you sink to a certain level, it ain't coming back.
Mhm.
And the Spaniards are in real trouble, but it's not just them. It's all over the Western world. It's all over the world.
It's all over the world.
But
Yeah, it's not just the
yeah,
West.
it's not just the West, but the West got there first, the West and the successful economies of East Asia. Zion spends a lot of time talking about China. I mean, we are all afraid of China. We see China's rise, its incredible rise. Zion says that, the Chinese bottomed out or began to decline demographically around 1990.
Mhm.
And they've been in free fall ever since. A free fall that's been masked by their incredible economic boom.
Yeah.
And he says it's just not going to last because you can't get around demography. If people aren't showing up for the future, your country doesn't have a chance. And he talks in the book about how China, for various reasons, it is in really bad shape. And he predicts the likelihood of internal wars, civil wars, which has been a curse of China's long history. But when the government can't provide materially for the people, things are going to fall apart.
Right. And what struck me about the analysis, and I admit, like, this is not like the first thing I think of almost ever, right? Especially when I'm thinking about this in sort of global political terms, is like, basics like food,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
energy, waterways for trade, ports, protections,
Hmm. Hmm.
all of these things that are like really not sexy, right, Rod? I mean, these are like really like basic things. And you start to realize, well, what then has, so if we're taking China, for instance, what has allowed China to become China as you and I know it, as our audience knows it today? Well, it's essentially been China has grown into what it is today on the back of the United States Navy protecting shipping lines and making them free
Yeah.
and safe since 1945, right?
Right. Right. Right.
And it's like something is sort of I just never think about that kind of
Why
thing.
not? Because you and I are focused on
Right,
culture, religion, that sort
right,
of thing.
right.
And I mean, we can't focus on everything, but it was good to read
Yeah,
Zeihan because he
yeah,
doesn't seem to care about this at all, about
right.
culture and religion and things like that. But when talking about reading him talking about demographics and from a material point of view, from an economic point of view, that inevitably plays into culture and religion. I
Right.
remember back in 2015, late 2015, listening to a talk by political scientist, and it was all off the record, or
Yeah.
rather, I can't cite it who it was, but
Okay.
he said he had done an American political scientist who had just finished a project for the European Union. They had asked him to do an analysis and see if it's possible to raise the birth rate without a return to religion. And he ran the numbers, did some analysis, and said, nope,
Yeah.
afraid not. And they weren't happy with that. Well, the collapse of religious faith, for whatever reasons, is playing directly into the collapse in the birth rate. And so you can't separate the loss of a sense, a belief in the transcendence, and the belief that there is something fundamentally good about having kids and raising a family, even though it costs you a lot materially. Zeihan talks about how,
Mhm.
back in the agricultural age, you needed to have a lot of kids to help take care of the farm and so on and so forth. But in when everybody's moving into the cities where houses are smaller, apartments are smaller, and you don't need those kids, it doesn't make sense economically to have them. So the only reason to have them would be because you believe that children are primary good. They don't need to be justified. And that's what religion does.
Hmm.
The fact that we're losing our religion means that we're going to lose a lot more than religion. We're losing families, and we're going to lose our economies.
Well, which is so, God, it's kind of, mind expanding to think about this, right? Because, you know, there's nothing more basic and fundamental than the God of Genesis, right? And the God of Genesis,
Yeah,
as I think you and I have talked about before, is positively obsessed with babies, right? I mean,
yeah,
God, that's what he cared. Genesis, right? To generate the gens, right? It's, he's obsessed with generation. And
yeah,
what is the first commandment? The first thing is be fruitful and multiply. Like it's not an afterthought. It's like it's the whole point. And
yeah,
and yet it seems that once we get to a certain point, it's the first thing we forget.
yeah, yeah. Because the generation below you and me,
Mhm.
they're just they come outright and say it. We don't want to have kids
Right.
because we want to travel, we want to do this, we want to do that, and I can see the temptation.
Yeah.
But I remember when my wife and I decided to start having kids. It was really kind of funny, actually.
Mhm.
We got married at the end of '97, and
Okay.
I don't know, maybe 6 months or so into our marriage, we're walking around. We'd come from Mass in Manhattan, and we're
Right.
walking down the street, and she was so frustrated. She's like, "Wait, we need to be doing something. We need to like have a have a bakery or this. And I looked at her and said, you want to have a kid, don't you? She said, no, no. And then
Yeah.
she goes, well,
Yeah.
maybe I
Maybe you
do.
do. Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
because but that was that deep impulse in her that it was instinctive. She felt like we are here for more than just enjoying going out to great dinners in Manhattan, going to the movies
Mm,
when we want to. And
mm,
so not long after that, a few months
yeah.
later, we got pregnant.
Yeah.
My point is simply this. I think that I don't think you get rid of that impulse
Right.
within a generation, but I think you can learn, and our culture instructs, catechizes people into thinking this to suppress that.
Yeah,
That
I got into a little bit of a back and forth on Twitter, and I was not able to finish it up. But it was this a guy, and I think he was a gay guy, and he was mad at me because he thought I was suggesting that gay people are the reason why we're running into a demographic cliff, and I said no, and I was Twitter has its limitations, as you know, right? And but my point was that it only takes a little bit of delay, and it only takes a conscription of a certain percentage of your population to steer them off the paths of what you and I might call
Mhm,
fertility,
mhm.
for lack of a better way to put it. It only takes scraping a little bit off at the margins to lead to a kind of catastrophic decline.
Yeah,
And again, Rod, I mean, when's the last time you picked up anything in the mainstream press, talking about demographic decline? I mean, we're still literally hearing about, overpopulation. And I mean,
sure.
it's a
Well, I
remarkable
get
disconnect, Rod.
no, it gets right back, Kale, to the thing we started talking about, where uh, people in our leadership class talk about what they want to talk about, not what we need to be talking
Mm,
about,
mm,
because it doesn't fit the narrative they want to believe, which is a narrative of personal liberation,
mm,
where you're free to have as much sex as you want, when you want it, with,
mm,
with whom you want it. There are no there's nothing to tie you down, to tie your will down. No religion, no kids, no this or that. The thing is, it's going to collapse. I mean, this is what Michel Houellebecq, the French
yeah,
novelist,
yeah,
this is something he's obsessed with in his writing. He's not a religious believer, but he does believe in the philosophy of Auguste Comte. I
oh,
guess
yeah.
he was a 19th century, maybe late 18th century, but French philosopher who believed, though he was an atheist, he was a sociologist, and he believed that all
He
societies,
invented the discipline of sociology.
right, and he believed that all societies have to be religious, that you cannot have a successful society without a sense of religion. Now, the French revolutionaries invented this ridiculous cult of reason that went nowhere.
Mm,
But I was talking to Paul Kingsnorth
mm,
in Ireland about this. He recently, like in the past 3 years, became a Christian, an Orthodox
right.
Christian, and he's told me that this is one thing he thinks about a lot, about
Mm,
how all society that's successful, whatever your religion, it is religious. That people, in order to bear the suffering that all of us have to do, it's just part of human life, and to continue to reproduce and to have faith in the future requires a belief that there is something beyond us, some fundamental importance, a fundamental transcendent structure, meaning that we are a part of. And if you don't believe that, if you believe that all of matter is just dead stuff, and that the purpose in life is just to get as much pleasure and happiness as you can in your limited time on earth, then you won't make the future. You won't sacrifice for the future.
That's exactly right, and I think that that's the key word, right? It's that, independent, whatever it is, the sort of the specifics of your religion may be, a religion that cherishes and conditions its adherence to sacrifice for the future. Um, that's what we mean here by religion, right? And so that the necessity for sacrifice, is it glory? Is it for the fatherland or the motherland? Is it for the race? I mean, is it for any of these sorts of things? And what is fascinating to me about this, and I was thinking a lot about Francis Fukuyama today, and this whole notion. Remember that the name of the book is "The End of History and the Last Man," and everybody focuses on the end of history part of it, and I do think he's basically correct. I think I've said that to you before. But the second part of the book, The Last Man, it's the, what do you do? Liberal, in other words, liberalism creates this enemy, right? That this sort of boredom, because it doesn't provide you with a supernatural or ontological destiny, right?
Right.
It's just more pleasure, more liberation, more of this, and it would seem, Rod, that culturally speaking, that's a recipe for suicide. And I mean extended suicide. I don't mean like go shoot
Yeah.
yourself. I mean, but cultural suicide.
You just wither away. Yeah,
Mhm.
and I mean, and this is what's happening in Europe. I mean, as difficult as things are in the United States, when you're here in Europe, people really wonder what they have to live for. I mean, I'm living, as most of our listeners know, in Hungary. It's a country that is led by a government that is at odds with most of the European Union because it believes that it has a future, or it should
Right.
have a future.
Should
The
have a future.
Hungarian people should have a future.
Yeah.
And so they're taking really aggressive means to try to raise the population, the birth rate. And even though it's a conservative populist government, they're doing things like involving themselves in the economy to make it easier for people to have kids, things that violate free market dogma.
Sure.
And I don't know if they're going to succeed, but they're the only ones that I can see in Europe, the Hungarian government, that is really taking the problem seriously. But it's not just about materialism. That's part of the picture.
Mhm.
The Prime Minister Viktor Orban, I've heard him say this, in personal conversation. He believes that the West has a death wish, and his country is part of the West.
Yeah.
It's been Christian for 1,000 years, but he believes that by abandoning its ancestral religion, and by giving itself over to hedonism and now wokeness, which is the redheaded stepchild of hedonism and individualism, it's consigning itself to defeat. Tonight at dinner, there was a Hungarian journalist there, and we were talking about, there's a lot of concern, even amongst some on the right here in Hungary, that the Orban government is uh, pivoting too much to the east, to China, to Turkey, and away from the West. And I think there's reason for concern. The Orban government wants to bring a Chinese university here, and that really concerns me as someone who basically supports the Orban government.
Yep.
Nevertheless, what's becoming clear to me is that this man, the prime minister, wants his country and his people, not just his country, but his people, to survive. That's his number one thing. And he sees that this ideology that has taken over the countries of the rest of Europe is a death wish.
Yeah, it would seem that you have a choice, right? To sort of to follow a spirit of, a spirit. I mean, I guess I kind of mean that. Like you can either follow a spirit of life, and a spirit of generation, or you follow a spirit of death and the spirit of degeneration. And I know that's a little bit binary here, but I really do kind of mean
Mhm,
that
mhm.
that you have to be fundamentally oriented toward life, and away from death. Toward birth and away from the abyss. And I wonder, why do you think that, in this instance, you talk about Orban? Why do you think Orban is so um, okay? I guess with looking to China and building a university there, is this being
Well,
opportunistic, or what's your sense
no,
of it?
I think, and I'm not necessarily approving of this because I
Okay.
would really be worried about anything to do with China. But um, I think that when you are a Hungarian and you realize that there's nobody else in this world who speaks your language,
Yeah.
there are like maybe 10 million Hungarians in Europe, and that's it. I mean, it's not even, they're not, there are more people in New York City than there are Hungarians in this world, who speak the language. And so it's easy to imagine your people not existing anymore, your people being assimilated out of existence.
Mhm.
And in a way that it's just impossible for Americans to think about ourselves,
Right.
because there's so many of us, right? And because English is the global language now, nobody speaks Hungarian but Hungarians.
Right.
But what that does is it focuses the mind,
Right.
right? And
Right.
so he can,
Right.
any Hungarian who pays attention can imagine the time when no Hungarians exist. Well, what makes Hungarians Hungarian? First of all, it's their language, but it's also the fact that they've been Christian, like 75% Catholic, 25% Calvinist, been Christians for 1,000 years. And there are other traditions too. And they look now, people like Orban look at what's happened to this country, especially the younger generation
Mhm.
who have no awareness of this. I mean, Kale, I recently saw there was a graphic showing how many people in each country in Europe are willing to fight for their country, not
Right.
for
Right.
Ukraine or any, but for their own country.
Right.
Hungary is one of the higher ones, but it's only something like, I think, less than 40%, which
Right.
is incredible. I mean, these
That's
are people
incredible.
who,
I know. I know.
yeah, within living memory in 1956, Hungarians went to the streets to fight the Soviets. But now, throughout all of Europe, I don't think there's a single country in which, I could be wrong about this, I don't think there's a single country, maybe Romania, uh, where a majority of people are willing to fight, even if their own country was invaded.
And I think that this is what you're talking about, this sort of this substrate of faith. And I'm not talking specifically about faith commitments toward Jesus or what have you. I'm talking about like the idea of faith that you believe in something more than the sort of the biological horizon of your life. Right.
Mhm, mhm.
Like and you wonder like where has that gone? Right. And of course, nothing is a bigger statement of faith or stepping out into faith than to have a child, for instance. Right. So I do
Right,
think
right,
that these
right.
things are connected, right? That this and the idea that you don't think that your home is worth fighting for. I mean, I don't know how you recover from that level of nihilism because that's
Yeah,
what that is, right? I mean, that means
yeah.
you believe in nothing.
Yeah, just your own. You believe in life, but only in the narrowest sense in biological survival, maybe.
Maybe,
Um,
maybe.
maybe that, but it's and it's all connected, and it can be overwhelming at times. I remember the thing that first got me started on the whole Benedict option project back
Yeah.
in 2004, 2005. Was first of all reading Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue, in which he
Hmm.
talked about the fall of Rome and people people living in a broader society that no longer believed in itself and was falling apart. But also around the same time, 2005, that's when Christian Smith, the sociologist of religion at Notre Dame, published his findings in which he identified moralistic therapeutic deism,
Hmm.
as the pseudo religion that has replaced Christianity in America and all other religions. Um, Christian Smith later wrote in one of his follow-ups, he said that the only thing that most young Americans, meaning young American adults, care about is being happy and successful in life. And if that is where things stand, you can't sustain a society on that. And it's I think about my own grandparents. They had kids in the Great Depression
Hmm.
when the whole country was a lot poorer than it
Hmm.
is now.
Radically.
I mean, yeah, my dad told me that they didn't have in his house indoor plumbing until he installed it as a senior in high school in the early 1950s, right?
Wow. Wow.
But all these people, as poor as they all were, they had kids because that's what you did. They didn't have to have kids to support the farm. They had kids because they believed that having kids was good. They believed that in producing the next generation that it was good. They didn't have to think about it. That's the key thing, Kale. I
Hmm.
think that when whether or not to have kids becomes something that couples stop and think about and weigh things up, I think it's over
Yeah.
because you're not.
What is that line you often say that, when something becomes optional, it becomes,
No,
what's it?
I think
It's
it's not
connected, right?
Newhouse's. It's
Yeah.
Newhouse's law. I think it might be what you're talking
Yeah.
about.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
when talking about religious
Yeah.
organizations, when orthodoxy is optional, it will eventually be prohibited.
Yeah,
Something like
and
that.
there's something like this, right? It's not exactly, but like when having children becomes an option, right? Like a luxury good,
Mhm, mhm.
it- they cease they cease to make
Yeah,
sense, right?
yeah, because you can't you can never fill it out on a spreadsheet
Right, right,
and
right.
say that because kids cost a lot. I mean, and more than just economically. I mean,
Yeah.
you have kids, I have
And the
kids.
worry, your
Oh
anxiety
my
about them, you
gosh.
love them, they're part of
Yeah.
you. I mean, yeah, of course. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and if maximizing personal pleasure and lessening anxiety is your primary directive, then you're not going to have kids. I just today I was seeing on Twitter that I think it's in South Dakota there was some Democratic state senator who condemned as un-American the idea that people should have kids. You know,
It's like what? What? Like what? Like that's
Yeah,
crazy.
yeah, she was condemning. There was some family, like not the Family Research Council, but something like that, saying that we should build a society where people are encouraged to have kids, blah, blah, blah. She said, that's un-American. Like, that you're not going to have an America, you
Right.
idiot.
Right. Well, I often wonder, about that with people who elect to not have kids. And look, you can have great reasons to not have kids. I don't mean it that way, but you know, it's like well, y'all kind of depend on people like me and others having kids. Like
Yeah,
if it's like we need kids to keep happening. Like I know this is
sure.
like a mystery to people, but like you actually need them to keep happening in order to sustain like the whole circus.
Yeah, well, that's one of Peter Zeihan's points
Right.
is that, and this is not new news, it's
Right.
that, when people retire and they're not productive anymore, um, then who's going to pay for
Right.
their medical bills and all that? And we're getting to a point in the United States, and he said the U.S. is going to actually be better off than any other country on earth, but everybody's still going to go through a lot of turmoil and trauma because there ain't going to be kids growing up to be productive workers who can support the older folks. We're all going to have to get used to a much lower standard of living.
That's right, right. And that's the interesting thing about the confluence of numbers, right? In terms of just human beings and time, right? There's a different, a person shows up on a spreadsheet as a one, right? But
Right.
what if the one is 7 years old versus what if the one is 10 years old? Like those are radically different ones in this sort of spreadsheet mentality, and there's not enough young ones in order to support the existing old ones at a certain point.
Yeah.
It becomes a reverse pyramid, right?
Well, I see we're run out of time here.
Yeah.
We need to wrap up. But when you convinced me in a text to read Zeihan's book, you said that the message you got from the book is that reality is biting back. That you can't just say that this is how we wish the world were and expect reality to obey that. Demography is destiny. There's no getting around it.
Right.
I think though, beyond the narrow demographic point, generally speaking, that we've created a world in which people think that if we want it to be true, it must be
Right.
true. If
Right.
if somebody has a penis but they think they're a woman, well, my God, they're a woman.
Right.
And if you say otherwise, you'll be exiled to the margins. This what's that old poem, Kipling poem, "The Gods of the Copybook
Right.
Headings."
That's right.
Reality that
Yeah.
that whole poem is about reality fighting back.
Right. Well, in what's interesting about that is like, so you can talk about this sort of in like the kind of trans biology space, but it's also like, like countries are physical realities, right? And some countries have borders, and some countries are islands, and some countries have easy ports, and some people have no ports. Some countries have food, natural food resources, and some countries don't. And what's telling to me is that this also helps me make sense, frankly, out of the sort of the madness, the so-called madness, and certainly the inhumanity of what Putin is doing in Ukraine, right? But if you understand what Putin is doing in Ukraine, basically the Russians are in a situation. It's like, look, we either fight this war and we win, or we cease to be as a people. And I don't
Yeah.
think enough people are kind of focused on that.
No, they don't even think about it.
Right.
And the overall tragedy for both Ukraine and Russia is they're both at sub-replacement
Right.
level,
Right.
serious sub-replacement level, and they're wiping out their males,
Yeah.
who could repopulate the country.
Yeah.
On that happy note, Kale, I have to say, don't get nothing on you. And to our listeners, go out and make some babies, please.
Indeed. Bye now.